How many of you have ever felt like you were at the edge of your faith? Like you've done everything you know how to do, and now you're just waiting for an answer, waiting for a breakthrough, waiting for God to show up. Faith is trusting when you don't understand. We all love trusting God when things make sense, don't we? When the job offer comes through, when the finances are in order, when the plan is clear. But real faith kicks in when nothing makes sense. When the door closes, when the prayer seems unanswered, when the road ahead is uncertain, God's plan is bigger than your understanding. Maybe today you're facing a situation that doesn't make sense. You're wondering why things didn't work out the way you planned, but let me remind you, just because you don't understand it doesn't mean God isn't working. Faith is easy when everything is going according to plan. When doors are opening, prayers are being answered, and life is smooth, it's simple to say, I trust God. But real faith is tested when you don't understand, when the doors stay closed, when the breakthrough doesn't come when you expect it, when life takes a turn you never saw coming. This is where many people struggle, because as humans, we crave control. We want to know the plan, see the roadmap, and have all the answers before we take the next step. But faith isn't about understanding everything. Faith is about trusting God even when you don't. Think about Abraham. God told him to leave his homeland and go to a place that he would show him. Notice, God didn't give him all the details up front. He didn't say, Abraham, here's the full itinerary. Here's the step-by-step plan, and here's what you can expect along the way. No, God simply said, go. And Abraham had to trust that God would reveal the rest as he obeyed. That's what faith looks like, stepping forward when you don't have all the answers. Maybe today you're in a season where nothing makes sense. You've been praying for something, but it feels like God is silent. You're believing for a breakthrough, but all you see is more obstacles. You're trying to do the right thing, but life just keeps throwing curveballs at you. This is when faith becomes real. The enemy wants you to believe that because you don't understand what God is doing, he must not be working. He wants you to think that if things aren't happening on your timeline, then maybe God has forgotten about you. But let me remind you of something. Just because you don't see it doesn't mean God isn't working. When you plant a seed in the ground, for a long time, you see nothing. You water it, you tend to it, but there's no visible sign of growth. But deep beneath the soil, something is happening. The roots are growing, the seed is taking shape, and at just the right time, it will break through the surface. That's exactly what God is doing in your life right now, even in the silence, even in the waiting, even in the confusion. God is working. He is aligning things, opening doors you can't see yet, preparing blessings that you don't even know are coming. Your job is not to figure out how or when. Your job is to trust. Think about Job. He lost everything. His family, his health, his wealth. His friends turned against him, and he had every reason to question what God was doing. But in the midst of his suffering, Job said, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. That is faith. Trusting when it doesn't make sense. Trusting when you have more questions than answers. Trusting when your emotions are screaming for you to give up, but your spirit says, hold on, God is not finished. Maybe you've been waiting for something for a long time, a breakthrough in your finances, restoration in your family, healing in your body. You've prayed, you've fasted, you've done everything you know how to do, and still nothing. This is where many people give up. They start thinking, maybe this isn't God's will for me. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe I should stop believing. But what if the answer is right around the corner? What if the breakthrough is closer than you think? What if God is using this delay to prepare you, to strengthen you, to build your faith for what's coming? You see, God doesn't just want to bless you, he wants to develop you. And sometimes the development happens in the waiting. Look at Joseph. He had a dream of being a ruler, but before he stepped into that calling, he was betrayed by his brothers, thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, and thrown into prison. Nothing about his situation made sense. If Joseph had looked at his circumstances alone, he could have thought, God, did you forget about me? Why would you give me a dream and then allow all of this to happen? But what Joseph didn't know was that God was positioning him for something greater. What looked like a setback was really a setup. What looked like betrayal was really preparation. What looked like a delay was actually God's perfect timing. And when the time was right, in one moment, Joseph went from the prison to the palace. That's how quickly God can turn things around. That's why you can't give up. That's why you can't let confusion or frustration steal your faith. Just because you don't see it now doesn't mean God, just because you don't understand it, doesn't mean God isn't working it all out for your good. Faith isn't about knowing all the answers. It's about knowing who holds the answers. It's about saying, God, I trust you even when I don't understand. I trust you even when it doesn't make sense. I trust you even when I feel like giving up because I know you are faithful. Maybe today, God is asking you to trust him on a deeper level. Maybe he's asking you to stop trying to figure everything out and just believe. Maybe he's saying, I know it doesn't make sense right now, but if you'll just trust me, I promise I will never fail you. God is bigger than your circumstances. Life is unpredictable. One moment everything is going well, and the next you're hit with a situation you never saw coming. A financial crisis, a health diagnosis, a broken relationship, an unexpected loss. These circumstances can shake you to your core. They can make you feel powerless, overwhelmed, and even forgotten. But no matter what you are facing today, I want to remind you of this truth. God is bigger than your circumstances. It's easy to get consumed by what's happening around you. When the problem is right in front of you, it feels massive. The weight of the situation can make it seem like there's no way out. But here's what you need to understand. Your problem is not bigger than your God. The enemy wants you to focus on how big your mountain is, but God wants you to remember how big he is. Think about the Israelites standing before the Red Sea. Behind them, Pharaoh's army was closing in, and in front of them was an impossible barrier. From a human perspective, it looked like there was no way out. What would God do? He split the sea wide open and made a way where there was no way. But that's the kind of God you serve. He is not limited by the circumstances that limit you. He is not intimidated by the obstacles in your path. The same God who parted the Red Sea, who shut the mouths of lions for Daniel, who brought Lazarus back to life, that same God is still at work in your life today. Maybe right now you feel like you're standing in front of an impossible situation. You don't see a way out, and you don't understand how things will ever turn around. But just because you don't see a way doesn't mean there isn't one. God specializes in making a way where there is no way. Look at David facing Goliath. The entire Israelite army was paralyzed by fear. They saw a giant that was too big to defeat, but David saw a giant that was too big to miss. He knew that his God was bigger than Goliath. He didn't rely on his own strength or his own weapons. He relied on the power of God. When you face difficulties, you have two choices. You can focus on how big your problem is, or you can focus on how big your God is. If you magnify your problem, it will consume your thoughts, steal your peace, and drain your faith. But when you magnify God, you remind yourself that nothing is impossible for him. Maybe you've been praying for something and you're wondering, why hasn't God answered me yet? Maybe the enemy is whispering in your ear, it's never going to happen, you're stuck, things will never change. But let me tell you, God is still in control. Just because you don't see the answer yet doesn't mean it's not coming. The Bible says in Isaiah 55, 8, 9, my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. That means that even when you don't understand, even when things don't make sense, even when you feel like giving up, God is working behind the scenes. He is orchestrating things in ways you can't see. He is lining up the right people, the right opportunities, and the right timing. Think about Joseph. He had a dream that he would be a ruler, but before that dream came to pass, He was betrayed by his brothers, thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and imprisoned. If Joseph had looked at his circumstances alone, he could have thought, God, where are you? Did you forget about me? But what Joseph didn't see at the time was that God was positioning him for something greater. Every setback was a setup. Every closed door was leading him closer to the palace. Your circumstances may not make sense right now. You may feel like nothing is going the way you planned, but just like Joseph, God is setting you up for something greater. He is not limited by what you see. He is not limited by your past, your mistakes, or what people say about you. He is bigger than all of it. When the enemy tries to fill your mind with fear and doubt, remind yourself, my God is greater. My God is stronger. My God is bigger than this problem. God didn't bring you this far to leave you. He didn't lead you to this place just to abandon you. He is a faithful God. He is a miracle-working God. And He is a God who finishes what He starts. No matter how difficult your situation looks right now, God is still on the throne. He is not surprised by what you're facing. He already has a solution. He already has a way out. He is already working behind the scenes on your behalf. The question is, will you trust Him? Will you believe that He is bigger than your circumstances? Will you stand in faith even when you don't understand? Will you keep moving forward knowing that if God is for you, nothing can stand against you? Fear is the enemy of trust. Fear has a way of creeping in when you least expect it. It whispers doubts, magnifies problems, and makes everything seem impossible. It keeps people stuck, unable to move forward, unable to fully trust God. Fear will always try to challenge your faith because it knows that if it can control your mind, it can control your actions. Trusting God requires faith, and faith and fear cannot exist in the same space. One will always try to overpower the other. When you give in to fear, you start questioning what God has already promised you. You start looking at the circumstances instead of looking at Him. But the moment you choose to trust, fear loses its grip. Think about the Israelites when they stood at the edge of the promised land. God had already given them the land. It was theirs. But when the spies came back with a report of giants in the land, fear spread like wildfire. The people started doubting. They started saying, we can't do this. We're not strong enough. The giants are too big. And because of their fear, they missed out on what God had for them. That's what fear does. It makes the problem look bigger than the promise. It convinces you that the obstacles in front of you are greater than the God who goes before you. But let me tell you something. There is no problem, no situation, no challenge bigger than your God. The enemy uses fear as a weapon because he knows that if he can get you to doubt, you will hesitate. And when you hesitate, you miss opportunities. You miss divine appointments. You miss the breakthroughs that God has prepared for you. Fear doesn't just keep you from stepping out. It keeps you from fully experiencing what God has for you. Look at Peter when he stepped out of the boat. As long as his eyes were on Jesus, he walked on water. But the moment he looked at the wind and the waves, fear took over and he began to sink. That's what happens when you shift your focus from God to your problems. Fear takes hold and faith starts to fade. Maybe right now fear is keeping you from trusting God in an area of your life. Maybe it's fear about your finances, your health, your family, or your future. Maybe God has been telling you to take a step of faith, but fear keeps talking you out of it. Fear will always come with excuses. It will tell you, what if you fail? What if you're not good enough? What if you step out and everything falls apart? But here's the truth. Fear is a liar. It will tell you worst case scenarios to keep you from believing God's best. God never called you to live in fear. Over and over again, the Bible says, do not fear. Why? Because God knows that fear will hold you back from walking in His promises. Think about Gideon. When God called him to lead Israel's army, Gideon was terrified. He saw himself as weak, as unqualified, as the least important person in his family. But God saw something different. He called Gideon a mighty warrior before Gideon ever did anything mighty. God sees you not as you are, but as he created you to be. Fear will always make you feel small, but trust in God will remind you that you are more than a conqueror. Fear will try to convince you that you are alone, but trust will remind you that God is always with you. Fear will tell you that you're not strong enough, but trust will remind you that God's strength is made perfect in your weakness. You have a choice. You can let fear dictate your life, or you can choose to trust God even when things don't make sense. Trusting God doesn't mean you won't feel fear. It means you won't let fear stop you. It means you will take this step anyway, knowing that God is bigger than anything you could ever face. Maybe today, God is asking you to release your fear and take a step of trust. Maybe he is saying, stop focusing on the giants and start focusing on me. Stop worrying about the what ifs and start believing that I am in control. Stop letting fear hold you back from everything I have planned for you. God has good things in store for you. He has a purpose for your life that is greater than your fear. But you will never experience it fully if you keep letting fear call the shots. Fear will try to steal your joy, your peace, your confidence, but it cannot steal what you refuse to give it. So choose trust. Choose faith. Choose to believe that the same God who has been faithful in the past will be faithful in the future. Choose to step forward even when fear tells you to stay back. Choose to silence the voice of fear and listen to the voice of God, because his voice always speaks life, hope, and victory. Obedience activates God's power. God's power is limitless. He can open doors no one can shut, make a way where there is no way, and do exceedingly abundantly above all we can ask or imagine. But there is something we often overlook. Obedience is the key that activates his power in our lives. Many people want to see God move in miraculous ways. They want breakthroughs, favor, and blessings. But they struggle when God asks them to obey. Obedience is not always easy. Sometimes it requires stepping into the unknown, letting go of our own plans, or trusting God even when it doesn't make sense. But one thing is clear: when we obey, we position ourselves for his power to work in our lives. Look at the story of Naaman in 2 Kings 5. Naaman was a great warrior, but he had leprosy. When he sought healing, the prophet Elisha told him to go wash in the Jordan River 7 times. At first, Naaman was offended. He expected something more dramatic, maybe a grand prayer or a supernatural touch, but instead he was given simple instructions. It didn't make sense to him, and he almost walked away. But when he finally obeyed, he was completely healed. God's power followed his obedience. How many times do we miss out on what God wants to do because we hesitate to obey? We want the miracle, but we resist the instruction. We pray for blessings, but refuse to follow the path God lays out. Faith is not just about believing. It's about acting on what God has said. Think about the widow in 1 Kings 17. She was gathering sticks to prepare one last meal for herself and her son before they died of starvation. Then the prophet Elijah came and told her, "Make me a small loaf of bread first." That request made no sense. She had barely enough food left for herself and her child. But she obeyed, and because of her obedience, God performed a miracle. Her jar of flour and jug of oil never ran dry. Obedience unlocks supernatural provision. Maybe God is asking you to take a step of faith. Maybe he is telling you to forgive someone, to give when it doesn't seem logical, to step into something new, or to walk away from something unhealthy. It may not make sense to you right now, but obedience is about trusting that God sees the bigger picture. Look at Peter. He and his fellow fishermen had been out all night and caught nothing. Then Jesus told him, "Let down your nets for a catch." Peter could have argued. He could have said, "Jesus, I'm the expert fisherman here. We already tried that and it didn't work." But instead he obeyed. And what happened? The catch was so big that their nets began to break. God's power showed up when Peter obeyed. We often want to see the result before we obey, but faith doesn't work that way. Obedience comes first, then the breakthrough. If you wait until everything makes sense, until it feels comfortable, or until you have all the answers, you may never move forward. Maybe God is telling you to trust Him in an area of your life, but fear is holding you back. Maybe He's asking you to step out, but doubt keeps creeping in. Let me remind you, delayed obedience is disobedience. The sooner you obey, the sooner you activate His power in your life. Think about Abraham. God told him to leave his home, his family, everything he knew, and go to a land He would show him. God didn't give him all the details. He didn't tell him exactly where he was going. He simply said, go, and Abraham obeyed. That one act of obedience changed history. What if Abraham had refused? What if Peter had kept his nets in the boat? What if the widow had held on to her last meal? Their miracles were on the other side of their obedience. Sometimes obedience requires sacrifice. It may mean letting go of your own plans, stepping outside your comfort zone, or doing something that doesn't make sense in the natural. But here's the truth. God always rewards obedience. Jesus performed many miracles, but often He gave people an instruction first. He told the blind man, go wash in the pool of Siloam. He told the lame man, get up, pick up your mat, and walk. He told the disciples, feed the 5,000 with what you have. Every time, obedience preceded the miracle. What if God is waiting for you to take the step? What if the breakthrough you've been praying for is on the other side of obedience? What if the door you've been asking God to open is tied to your willingness to trust Him completely? God doesn't ask for obedience to make our lives difficult. He asks because He knows what's best. He sees what we can't see. He knows what's ahead. And when we follow His leading, we experience His power in ways we never could have imagined. Obedience is not about understanding every detail. It's about trusting the one who does. It's about surrendering your will for His, believing that He is faithful, and knowing that when you step out in obedience, you step into His divine power. God's timing is always perfect. Waiting is one of the hardest things to do, especially when you're believing for something that feels urgent, something that feels like it should have happened by now. You pray, you trust, you expect, but when the answer doesn't come right away, doubt starts to creep in. Did God hear me? Did I miss something? Why is it taking so long? But let me tell you this. God's timing is always perfect. He is never late, never early, but always right on time. You may not understand why things are taking longer than you expected, but God sees what you cannot see. He knows what's up ahead. He knows when the right people, the right opportunities, and the right conditions will come together. He is working behind the scenes in ways you can't even imagine. Think about Joseph. God gave him a dream when he was a young man that he would one day be in a position of great influence, but instead of rising to the top immediately, Joseph faced betrayal, false accusations, and years in prison. From the outside, it looked like his life was going in the opposite direction of God's promise. But God was using every delay, every challenge, and every trial to prepare him. When the time was right, in a single day, Joseph went from the prison to the palace. If Joseph had been promoted too soon, he wouldn't have been ready for the responsibility. But because he waited and trusted God's timing, he was able to step into his destiny fully prepared. Maybe you're in a season where it feels like nothing is happening. Maybe you've been praying for a breakthrough in your finances, your health, your family, or your career, and it seems like God is silent. But just because you don't see movement doesn't mean God isn't working. Some of the greatest miracles happen in the waiting season. Look at Sarah and Abraham. God promised them a child, but years went by with no sign of the promise coming to pass. They got impatient, and Sarah decided to take matters into her own hands by having Abraham have a child with Hagar. But that wasn't God's plan. When Sarah was 90 years old, Long past the time when having a child seemed possible, God fulfilled his promise. God's delay is not his denial. Just because it hasn't happened yet doesn't mean it won't happen. The enemy will try to convince you that God has forgotten about you, that your prayers aren't being heard, that maybe it's too late. But the truth is, God is never in a hurry, but he is never late. Think about the story of Lazarus. When Lazarus was sick, his sisters, Mary and Martha, sent word to Jesus, expecting him to come immediately, but Jesus didn't come right away. He waited until Lazarus had been dead for 4 days before showing up. To them, it looked like Jesus was too late, but Jesus had a greater plan. Instead of healing Lazarus from sickness, he raised him from the dead. What seemed like a delay was actually a setup for a greater miracle. Maybe God has you waiting because he is preparing something bigger than you imagined. Maybe he is protecting you from something you can't see. Maybe he is strengthening your faith, refining your character, or aligning circumstances in ways you don't understand yet. Waiting on God's timing requires trust. It means believing that his ways are higher than our ways, that he knows what's best, and that he will come through at the perfect moment. The enemy will try to make you impatient, make you doubt, make you settle for something less than what God has for you. But don't fall for the trap of thinking you have to figure it all out on your own. Isaiah 40:31 says, "But those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength." Waiting on God doesn't weaken you, it strengthens you. It builds endurance, deepens your faith, and prepares you for what's coming next. Think about David. He was anointed as king when he was just a young shepherd boy, but he didn't step into that position overnight. He spent years being faithful in the fields, fighting battles, and going through trials before the throne was his. If he had tried to take the throne too soon, he wouldn't have been ready. But when the right time came, nothing could stop God's plan. What God has for you will not pass you by. No delay, no obstacle, no setback can keep you from what he has promised. But you have to trust his timing. Maybe you feel like you've been waiting forever. Maybe you're starting to question whether the promise will ever come to pass. But let me remind you, God finishes what he starts. If he gave you the promise, he will bring it to fulfillment. If he led you to it, he will bring you through it. So don't give up. Don't grow weary. Don't let frustration cause you to make decisions out of impatience. God's plan is unfolding exactly as it should. He is lining things up, moving people into position, and making a way where there seems to be no way. You may not see it yet, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. When the time is right, you won't have to force it. You won't have to manipulate things to make them work. God will open the door and no one will be able to shut it. What he has planned for you is worth the wait. Trusting God beyond limits leads to a life of victory. Trusting God is easy when everything is going well, when doors are opening, prayers are being answered, and life feels smooth. But real trust is tested when things don't make sense, when the waiting feels long, when the obstacles seem too big, and when fear tries to take over. Trusting God beyond limits is what leads to a life of victory. So many times we set limits on what God can do in our lives, not because he is limited, but because we struggle to fully trust him. We trust him to a certain point, but then fear steps in and we start doubting. We trust him with small things, but when it comes to something big, we hesitate. But God is calling us to trust him completely, beyond what we can see, beyond what we can understand, beyond our comfort zone. Look at Joshua and the Israelites. God promised them the land of Canaan, but when they arrived, there were giants in the land. Instead of trusting God beyond the limits of their fear, most of them backed down. Only Joshua and Caleb believed that if God had promised it, he would bring it to pass. Because they chose to trust beyond limits, they stepped into the victory that others missed out on. How many times do we stop short of victory because we let fear win? Maybe God is asking you to trust him in a way that feels uncomfortable. Maybe he is leading you to do something that doesn't make sense in the natural. Maybe you're facing a challenge that feels impossible. This is where your faith is tested. Will you trust him beyond what you can see? Think about Peter. When he saw Jesus walking on water, he said, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you." Jesus said, "Come." Peter stepped out of the boat and started walking on water, something that was completely impossible in the natural. But the moment he took his eyes off Jesus and focused on the waves, he began to sink. As long as Peter trusted beyond limits, he walked in victory. It's the same for us. When we keep our focus on God, when we trust him without questioning every detail, we walk in the supernatural. But the moment we let fear, doubt, or circumstances control us, we start to sink. God is asking you to trust him beyond the limits of what makes sense. Abraham had to trust beyond limits when God told him to leave his homeland and go to a place he would show him. Abraham didn't have all the details. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't have a full plan. But he trusted God, and because of that trust, he became the father of many nations. Victory follows trust. Sometimes trusting God means waiting longer than you expected. Sometimes it means letting go of your own plans and surrendering completely. Sometimes it means stepping into something new with no guarantees except God's promise. But one thing is certain: God always honors trust. Think about the walls of Jericho. God told the Israelites to march around the city for 7 days, and on the seventh day to shout. In the natural, that didn't make sense. How could walking and shouting bring walls down? But because they trusted beyond limits, because they obeyed without understanding, those walls fell and they took the city. Trust leads to breakthrough. If you want to live in victory, you have to decide that you will trust God no matter what. Not just when it's easy, not just when things are going your way, but even when it feels like nothing is happening. Even when the battle looks too big, even when the answer seems delayed, even when fear whispers that you won't make it. God is not limited by time, by resources, by circumstances, or by human logic. He is the God of the impossible, but he moves in the lives of those who trust him completely. Faith is not just believing in God, it's believing God. It's knowing that if he said it, he will do it. It's standing firm even when the enemy tries to shake you. Maybe right now you're in a situation that feels overwhelming. Maybe you're facing something that seems too big for you to handle. Maybe you've been waiting for a breakthrough and it feels like it's never coming. Let me remind you, God has already gone before you. He has already made a way. He has already set up the victory. But you have to trust him enough to keep walking. Don't let fear hold you back. Don't let doubt steal what God has for you. Don't let circumstances make you question his faithfulness. His plan is bigger, his power is greater, and his victory is already won. When you trust God beyond limits, you step into a life of victory. Not a life without challenges, but a life where every battle leads to a breakthrough, every test becomes a testimony, and every obstacle is just a setup for something greater. God is faithful, and if you trust him without limits, he will take you places you never imagined